given the nature of this series, it makes sense that for some of these videos at least, we will instead be discussing mythologies from around the world to see what might be being drawn from, or maybe just more generally to introduce you potentially to some stories from different cultures. And since there are so many around the world, we might think to do this most efficiently in this video format by just having quick snapshots of maybe about 10 of them. That intro sounds familiar, as if it's been said before in a way and now is being retold like this. Well, that in itself again is fitting for what this series is. If it is familiar to you, then that might be because you are one of the ones who watched the original Medley of Myths video, linked up there, and as you can tell from the title or thumbnail presumably, this is the sequel to that, Medley of Myths number 2. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where usually I'll be talking about the lore of the books that I'm writing, although today we'll be doing what I just set up in that cold open. Now, yes, technically this sort of video is more of just a crossover of the different social media channels, which, as always, are linked in the description below, in this case specifically the Instagram, where if you haven't been following that, as part of a rota of types of posts which I do around the release of each book, one of those slots is generally discussing a myth, more like a figure or a tale or an artifact, something like that, from world mythologies. These kind of videos, wherein I would then relay some of those again in video form, were, I think, originally meant to be more frequent. Not that I actually put them in the schedule as more frequent, but that was the sense that I had in my mind when I first thought of doing this sort of thing. Obviously, that hasn't happened. It's been a while since we did the original, and because of that, we now have a lot of other posts of this nature that went up on the Instagram in the interim. Far too many to cover in one video, especially if we're sticking to the format of 10. As such then, rather than going through just what the next 10 were after what I finished off in the original video, because while I didn't count, I think there's something like give or take 60 of these since then, so if we still kept on doing 10 and 10 and 10, we'd never catch up, would be perpetually falling further and further behind. Rather, what I've done is I've taken all of those other ones that we haven't talked about yet, written them on slips of paper, and put them inside of this hat, which I'll then randomly pick out and read, and then I'll discuss in brief detail what that myth concept thing is. Yes, the pieces of paper aren't all the same size. I've not paid attention to what's written on what. That doesn't make a difference to me. I don't know why I'm feeling the need to justify that this isn't rigged, but it's not. And also, as we do this, we may notice that on the back of some of these, if it shows up, yeah, we do have some writing on there as well. That's simply because for the sheet of paper that I used, it's the back of what, around this time last year, I was using when making notes for doing online maths tutoring. This sheet, I'm pretty sure, was like differentiation, quotient rule, that sort of thing. Again, I've not paid attention to what slips have what maths equations on the back, so that doesn't make a difference. Yeah. With that all said, though, let's just get straight into our first one. So, have our hats, and again, mix them up. And our first one, how extremely fitting. The horse, is that going to show up if I do this? Well, that's going to show off my terrible handwriting, because I can write better than this. It's just I did it quickly because I didn't think they'd be showing it on camera, but that says the horsemen / the seals, i.e. the 7 seals. These were originally 2 distinct posts on the Instagram, given months apart, but considering that they both relate to basically the same thing, I didn't want to create a situation whereby you would have me drawing out both of them separately and then basically having to tell the same twice. So both on there. Alright, well, in terms of the horsemen of the apocalypse, as we understand them from their original depiction in the Book of Revelation, in the Bible, we might nowadays think of as death, war, famine and pestilence. Well, technically in the original scripture, at least from what we can understand of what the originals might have been, pestilence wasn't originally a part of that. He was added later, as might be covered on a different slip depending on what we pick out, and also generally whichever ones I don't pick out now can be saved for if we do this video a third time and so forth. But we may pick out this one for how pestilence was introduced, because I have decided, because that's a specific thing, I'll keep that separate. But either way, for now it wasn't that. Rather, the other one was conquest. Now I can't think off the top of my head. I think it was something like famine, war, conquest, and death. Death was definitely last. Don't know about the other order, and they each have their own type of horse of a different colour, like death riding in on the pale horse. Now, this riding in of the four of them doesn't happen until after we deal with the 7 seals first. And when we're talking about 7 seals, we're referring to how, well, you could interpret it in a couple of different ways. We could be saying that by seal, that was merely being used in a figurative sense, because that would have been understood by people at the time as this thing which seals up, say, a message or parchment or whatever, and could only be opened by a specific person with a witness. So we're saying to initiate Armageddon, the apocalypse. Armageddon's a specific place. So to initiate the apocalypse, this thing had to be opened by a specific person, this being the Lamb. Or we could be thinking of it as literally the apocalypse is held within a scroll of paper which has 7 wax seals on it and need to be broken. However you want to envision it. But either way, these need to be broken by the Lamb. The first 4 seals, each respectively, unleash one of those horsemen, within the other 3 being that all those who have died in the name of God, either martyrs, will be risen up again. The sky, and also the moon and the stars and the heavens all get swept away, and the mountains fold back, or whatever it is. So basically everything above is exposed to whatever is beyond. And then lastly, with the opening of the 7th seal, you have silence, as then the angels and everyone else prepare for apocalypse. With that one, that's probably enough to be getting on with. So, with again, helpful with the horsemen. I mean, not guaranteeing that you know about those, but there's usually well, they're kind of in the cultural consciousness, probably. I don't say too much more. All right. For the second one, sure, we'll continue showing it off. We have Grower. Is that going to show up in the light? Whatever. G-R-O-A. The spell. As you can see, the spell's on the bottom of the screen as well, regardless. This one is, in fact, the sequel, as it were, to a different thing that we might see later. Don't know. Doesn't really matter. We'll cover this now. Anyway, either way, so what we have is, in Norse mythology, after Thor defeated the giant Hrungnir, he still nevertheless ended up with the giant's whetstone lodged into his head. Therefore, he went to Grower so that she might be able to heal him, to remove it. As she was performing this, however, and they were talking in the meantime, Thor happened to mention that he had in fact met her husband on his travels. Her husband, Orvandil, having been away for a long time, and that being its whole other tale whereby Orvandil was suffering from frostbite, and Thor managed to help him. However, he couldn't save his toe, and his toe ended up becoming a constellation in the sky. But anyway, the shock of suddenly hearing that her husband is indeed alive caused Grower to slip up, and the whetstone lodged itself back into his head again, where it hence remained. Subsequently, at some point, Grower died. However, that wasn't the end of her tales. Rather, in this spiritual form, she was still able to communicate with her son, Svipdaga, who she can then give aid to, as I say, via her skills in divination. So that was a short one, just a couple of little... Oh, she's, at least from what she seems to be more known for when I was looking into her and researching her, more of a supporting cast member to other main heroes who are going along, but still there and important nonetheless. Number 3. Okay. For Goya. Whatever. Don't judge my handwriting. So, Vigoria is from Etruscan mythology, which existed rather next to Roman and Greek, which we know more of. So they became more infamous, and Etruscan mythology rather fell to the wayside. Because of this, when trying to look up these sorts of figures, usually you will instead have comparisons to existing Greek or Roman mythological characters in turn, and if you try to find pictures, will usually be of that again. So the idea is it didn't just disappear, it kind of got consumed and melded into those other ones. But nevertheless, we do have records of what their specific own figures and characters were, including this Vigoria. Maybe could have made this note earlier, but we'll say it now as in the first half of this video. I cannot guarantee that I'm pronouncing either words correctly. This is just what I feel like they maybe sound like phonetically. If you know better, correct me. To tie those concepts even more tightly together, it would potentially be that this figure, Vigoria, in conjunction with the monstrous child figure Tages, they were the ones that actually wrote the texts that we now have. Unfortunately, the language in which they are written is mostly lost to us, so a lot of it we aren't able to translate. What then can we consider? What maybe did she write that we now aren't able to interpret that might nevertheless be important to us? There are actually a number of other Etruscan figures that I could have done those posts about, but again, there really is just very little information beyond that. This was the god of this episode. Vigoria was the scribe. Was it you have the sky god, you have angels and whatever. Beyond just stating his roles, there's not details that at least I could easily find. Therefore, again, these keep many short, but short is good for this format. If you want to try to research more of this in particular into yourself, go ahead and do it. But that one, that figure specifically, is more steeped in mystery, as the caption to that Instagram post filled itself out using instead those notions of, well, like, we don't know, because I had nothing else to say, but wanted to acknowledge again. Might be a name that is relevant at some point. Reynard the Fox. Okay, so when we talk about myths and stuff like this, not all of them may actually relate to myths themselves. They could be folk tales, fairy tales. In some cases, we'll be taking from religion as well. Again, trying not to step upon people's existing beliefs, whatever, but yeah. Take different places. Reynard the Fox is from folk tales, stories from medieval Europe. Now, part of me is thinking I should be able to recount more about this, considering that he was among the characters in the tales that I studied in one of my modules at university. It's about medieval literature. You had, those sort of fables whereby he would try to trick the other animals, birds, such forth, that they would allow him then to eat them, and then the animals tried to band together to give him his recompense, but again he managed to outsmart them, or in other cases maybe he did indeed meet his downfall. But for the sense of that, to be clear, he is your trickster character of these sorts of tales, to keep on using that word. In these sorts of stories, as that alludes to, you end up with a lot of anthropomorphic characters and these animals, which, as you might expect, then, at least on some level, usually the animal that they are exemplifies their characteristics, although maybe not to the extent of, like, Zootopia. If I understand that correctly, I haven't actually seen that film. Either way, in regards to Reynard being a fox, you have him being sly, cunning. You also have him being cowardly if the situation would turn against him in that case. And, if it came down to actually... He's a trickster, he's manipulating people. If it came down to it, if there was a more intimidating threat, he might not stand up as well. Also, in terms of how he's presented in these stories, I'm presenting him as a trickster, and yet he is, like, the main character, the focal character, a number of them could sometimes be nevertheless seen as the hero, as the one overcoming some injustice, as otherwise these stories too could be thought of as being satirical and judgmental of the ruling orders of the time, at least. While I'm not necessarily saying there was a conscious direct connection towards it, in the Disney animated Robin Hood, he was a fox, then having that role of standing up against the Sheriff of Nottingham and whoever it was. So that kind of vibe to it in these stories that aren't otherwise about King Arthur, Sir Gawain, Melisane, and these other ones that, again, I'm trying to think of from university, but you get the gist. So if we go on to number 5, because again, these are just shorter snaps. If you want to look more into them, you can either... Well, some of the Instagram posts aren't in too much more detail, although they will be structured a lot better than what I'm saying here and ad-libbing. But, you can also look into it more yourself. It's just more in taste. We have... this is, again, really where I should have been... my writing. That says Aboriginal serpents, if you can read that. Anyway, so certain things don't have given names to them, or actually, I guess, well, twofold. What I'm about to talk about here didn't have a lot of specific names given to them, but also this is now talking about a collective. I was grouping a number of concepts from Australian Aboriginal beliefs here, rather than just picking out a single one, these then under the common theme of relating to snakes. For instance, if we're looking at the creation of the world per their view, you had everything being this blank surface, and then you had a giant snake rising up from underneath the surface, and as it moved around, it, hence pushing the earth out of the way, moulded the landscape as we now understand it. And it then begat other smaller snakes, which would go on to form other things. Certain snakes would end up eventually becoming among the ancestors for humanity. Other ones, referred to by type as Wagails, would go on to form specific waterways, so rivers and other bodies of that sort. You had otherwise this figure called Taipan, who had abilities to control life and death and the elements. He had a son who in turn went on to run away with the snake Tintora, only to subsequently be killed by her husband who came after them, he being called Wala. The boy's blood went on to be the red that we hence see in all rainbows. Otherwise, we next have a man called Nagakork, who I didn't specify the reason for in that post caption, but I think it was something like his other tribesmen had either killed the animals that he was going to kill for food, or he'd already killed them but the others ate that food. Something to do with animals, I'm pretty sure. Either way, to get retribution upon them, he called on the serpent Kurichalapongo, who then caused water levels to rise all around, flooding the whole area. Eventually some, but not all, of those other tribesmen, in order to survive, were forced to transform into other new, for them, types of animals, which we would hence recognise as being aquatic, around that sort of environment. Again, you can look more into the specific stories if you want, but the other thing I noted then was, if we just want to draw a comparison, in these cases in Australia, you had serpents being involved in various elements of creation, either of the world in general, or as elements of the world that we can recognise to this day. Meanwhile, if we go to the other side of the globe, like where the Norsemen were, you have figures such as Jormungandr, who, assuming we don't pull out that slip, I'll stay anyway here, you have as being the world serpent, would be a part of the destruction in Ragnarök, and is otherwise in general a dangerous force. So just a bit of comparison there that leads us on to number 6. I cut that there, but that's not for me redoing this, that's just because I paused to double check we're on number 6. We have Pastaha, whatever, which at time of recording is the latest one that I have done, so hopefully I don't, well, no, I will for certain words. Either way, this is a type of real artefact that you could study if you wanted, it being the term for a magical book from the Toba Batak people of North Sumatra in Indonesia. These volumes would have pages made from softened tree bark that were then, these strips of bark that could be, I think it's on average around 7 metres in length, then all folded up into the pages, but they have at least one that's made up of 15 metres. Either way, then those held between two hard covers, then tied all up. These books would be collated by a type of magical priest called a Datu. I don't know the pronunciation, but spelling will be on the screen. And these hence would usually refer to one of 3 types of hadatuon, or magic. You would have them, in kind of an instructional sense, talking about the art of preserving life, i.e. white magic, the art of destroying life, black magic, or thirdly, the art of divination. You may have elements bleeding across one into the other, but say usually each individual Pustaha would focus on one out of those. And you can study them if you want. Well, again, you'd need to get access to them from those people, but it would be theoretically possible rather than a mythic figure existing away from our way of interacting with them, regardless of whether then the magic in these books you think works or not. To number 7. Don't look. Nain Rouge. So this is a more modern thing, relatively speaking, as opposed to, we've talked about ancient mythologies here and there. And this one more relates specifically to a modern city, so in the last few hundred years, Detroit. This figure, which may either arguably, depends on who you ask, have been brought over by French settlers as a version of a lutin hobgoblin, or, according to others, it's a form of Native American spirit that was already existing there. Maybe it was the result of the two cultures and paranormal stuff combining. Either way, whatever it came from, this thing, the Nain Rouge, as I say, I've been saying that wrong because it's meant to be French, but so this imp-like creature that's meant to look like an old man, except it also has red skin and broad grin that shows loads of pointed teeth, then also with bright glistening eyes, and strangely apparently no physical depths. That would seem to imply it's two-dimensional. So this individual, it's this one, not a type of creature, but it's an individual creature here. And when in the 1700s you had the city of Detroit being founded by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, hopefully I haven't butchered that, but either way, he was warned by the local people that he should also be sure to ingratiate the Nain Rouge. He refused to do so, however, and as such, this imp cursed the city evermore. And so, whenever it is seen by anyone within Detroit, something bad then happens. As such, each year you have a parade through the streets, which is meant to ward off this imp, this nuisance, for the next calendar cycle, if possible. So if any of you are specifically in Detroit, let me know if you're aware of this one, if you've maybe seen it yourself. Right, number 8. On top of the on top of what was a second differential, equaling, Jang, D-J-A-N-G. Back to Australia, actually. Okay, so in this case, we have this primordial magic that inhabits all things. After what we had with the serpents in the previous one, the subsequent actual ancestors of humanity, they started off, or that earlier stage, were spectral or spiritual beings, and what they did is they put that power into the trees, into the rocks, all of these things that can be found in the environment. Certain areas have stronger concentrations of Jang than others, and what this now means is that in the present day, or through all the generations since, as we're now in corporeal forms, with the right dances or rituals or just saying the right words around, again, certain areas have a higher chance of tapping into it than others, but potentially you can tap into this power that was left behind as a gift for the descendants. And with this, you may, for instance, be able to call for either sun or rain, whichever is needed. Maybe you could even talk to those ancestors themselves, as again, it's kind of a form of them that they put into those elements of nature. For number 9, we have Jarlabru. So when we're talking about bridges in Norse mythology, we might first think of the Bifrost, which will relate to Asgard. However, you have this other one, clearly by how I've set this up, Jarlabru, which instead is used by souls to transition to hell, as in just with a single L, one of the realms in Norse cosmology. And in order to cross it, to enter hell itself, where those certain souls are next meant to be, so the first of all have travelled through valleys into complete darkness, and here they suddenly find this golden roofed bridge structure over the river Gull, whereby they will be met by its guardian Modguder, where they will have to say their name and their business in order to be let across. And although presumably they'll be going that way because they're dead souls that need to go there, just needs to make sure that they are the dead that are going there, or that it's foretold that eventually the living will try to cross as well. For now, just make sure it's only the dead that are crossing. And also, that guardian's more primary role is to make sure no souls are trying to get back out the other way, escaping hell, which they're not meant to do. And with that, number 10, to finish off this video, thus leaving the rest potentially ambiguous for next time, or for you to instead go to the Instagram at the Ragnarök Chronicles, link below, to see for yourself if you are curious to scroll back through all those posts and see the future ones. We have Vördfulnir. Yay, pronunciations and my spelling. I need to stop harping on about that. Okay, so I don't know if I may have mentioned it in reference, in passing, at the end of the first video, because the first one ended with Ratatoska, who is the squirrel creature that goes up and down Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. But either way, at the top now, so the opposite end to where Hell was for the previous note, we have here Vördfulnir and the eagle. The eagle then not being given a name as well, for some reason. Either way, this first one being a hawk that sits atop the head of the eagle, who in turn sits upon the uppermost branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, as I say. So you have Ratatoska going up and down, giving messages to these birds, and also to Nitoga, the dragon, at the bottom. And elsewise, these two birds are possessed by the knowledge of many things, and you can imagine, perched on top of the worlds, quite literally as they are, they will see a lot of what is going on. Why is the eagle choosing to remain anonymous? We can only wonder, but there they are, up there, among other birds that, again, I'm pretty sure I mentioned first time, and others I won't mention yet, but also important to the Norse mythology. But with that notion, briefly, fittingly ending on Norse 4, again this being the Ragnarök Chronicles, even though the franchise as a whole, as I've said previously, will cover mythologies from all around the world, we'll wrap that up there. I hope you have found those little snippets interesting, or they've at least planted the seeds of interest so that you may go on to look into this sort of thing for yourself, regardless of your opinions of whether or not you'll read the books, which please do. There's nevertheless already these stories, so many existing from around the world, and looking into them can give interesting insights into cultures. It's strange how sometimes you even have tales from completely different parts of the world which nevertheless share similar motifs. And, like, you can change the names, but what's going on, I forget, because I wasn't planning to talk about this, the cultures that they come from and the terms and whatever, but you have a few different stories whereby a person ends up cutting down a whole forest in order to make a boat, for instance, among other things. They then have to drain a lake as well. Things to a couple of elements like that. I forget exactly, but obviously it's quite possible easily that these were all inspired by some similar event, maybe a drought wherein like the lakes dried up or whatever it was, or trees came down. But either way, it's interesting to find those connections, and if not, there's still so much more. Besides, I am rambling as ever, so check out the other stuff. Plenty of other videos on the channel. You can check out part 1 if you didn't see that one yet. And either way, regardless, whatever happens, until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories, like the people who told these myths did.